Hi, my name is Shrey, and today I'll be explaining question 2 from Leetcode's most recent competition, 199. Question 2 is bulb switcher 4. And basically the question gives you an input binary string consisted of ones and zeros, and it wants you to return the minimum number of flips required to form the target which they give you. So what does that exactly mean? So let's dive in straight to example 1. And initially they give you this target string which you want to obtain. And in this case you want to return 3 because that's the minimum number of moves needed to reach this target string essentially. So the question tells you that initially all the bulbs are turned off. So turned off bulbs are represented by zeros and turned on bulbs are represented by ones. So initially you start with all bulbs turned off, just like that. So the way to turn on bulbs are you start at an element. So you can basically turn on all bulbs starting from an element to the last element. So in this case, if you want to turn on all the bulbs starting from element 3, you would do that by turning on all the bulbs starting from element 3 to the end. So 1, 1, 1. So we've reached the target for the last 3 elements, and now we have to figure out how to reach this target for the first 2 elements. So now if we want to flip all the elements starting from this position to the end, we would do that by saying 1, 1, and then these 3 would now be turned off, 0, 0, 0. And finally, if you want to turn this bulb off and these bulbs on, you would flip all the bulbs starting from element 1 to the end. So 1, 0, 1, 1, 1. And that's how you would reach this target position in move 1, move 2, and move 3. So that's how you reach this target position in 3 moves. So now we've understood the problem. How do we figure out how many minimum moves we need to reach the target position? And actually the solution to this is very straightforward. All you have to do is you have to determine how many times the bulbs switch, basically. So you have 1 here, and then it switches to 0. So it switched once, and then from 0 to 1, it switches again. So it's switched twice. So you have to determine how many times it switches, and then you add 1. So that's the solution to this. And I know it seems a little bit confusing, but the reason for that is when you deal with these, you have to basically deal with individual parts of the target string at a time. So when you deal with this part, that's considered one part. And then when you deal with this part, it's considered a second part. And then finally, when you deal with this part, it's considered a third part. So let's look at example 2. So we're dealing with this one part, which is 1. We're dealing with the second part, which is 2. And this third part, which is 3. And if we use the solution which I just said, you have to find how many times it switches. So from 1 to 0, that's once. From 0 to 1, that's twice. And then you add 1. One more thing to note is that if you have leading zeros, you want to get rid of them before implementing this solution. And the reason for that is, say that example 1 was this target solution. And the reason for this is because when you flip the bulb starting from one element to the end, these leading zeros make no difference because you would never flip the bulb starting from here because these 3 will always have to remain 0. So you can basically ignore all leading zeros. So in example 3, if we ignore all leading zeros, the target string would be empty, so we would return 0. And for example 4, we get rid of these 2 leading zeros. So we start off from 1, and 1 switches to 0, so that's 1. 0 switches to 1, that's 2. Then again, 1 switches to 0 and 0 switches to 1. So it switches 4 times, and then you add 1 more to reach 5. And this solution will work for all possible scenarios. So let me just quickly explain how this would work in pseudocode. So the first thing you need to do is you need to determine, or I'd say get rid of all leading zeros by determining the first one in the target, and then taking substring from that one to the end of the target. So what does that mean? So in example 4, we would determine the first one, which is here, and then we would just take the substring from this one to the end. So we would essentially remove the leading zeros. The second thing we need to do is we need to use a loop to traverse through the string, and every time the current element doesn't equal the next element, or actually a better way to phrase that is every time the current element doesn't equal the element before, you want to update a counter. Finally, you break out of the loop and you return the counter. So that's the entire solution to this question. I know that this solution may still seem a little bit confusing, just because the only way to find out how many times, or the only way to determine the answer is by seeing how many times it switches and then adding 1 to it. Oh, and that's one thing I missed. You want to actually set, once you get rid of the zeros, you want to set counter to 1, not 0. And then let me just fix these numbers right here. So yep, that's the entire solution to this question. Because it was a little bit confusing, if you have any questions, just leave them down in the comments below. And as always, if this video helped you in any way, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.